Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I stand in opposition to Bill C-4, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget that was tabled in Parliament on March the 21st, 2013. I stand in opposition to Bill C-4 for two main reasons, Mr. Speaker. First, content, and the second, process. Content, Mr. Speaker, in that this budget implementation bill impacts much more, Mr. Speaker, than the Conservative budget. This is an omnibus bill, Mr. Speaker. The word omnibus is derived from the Latin, and it means, Mr. Speaker, for everything. The Conservative government has thrown practically everything into this omnibus bill, Mr. Speaker, as is their habit. This is the fourth omnibus budget implementation act, the fourth, Mr. Speaker. This omnibus bill amends 70 laws or regulations. 70 laws or regulations in one bill, Mr. Speaker. That's a massive amount of content. How is a member of Parliament, how is an opposition expected to thoroughly analyze and study all the amendments in this one bill, Mr. Speaker, especially with the introduction of time allocation? But I'll come back to that in a moment, Mr. Speaker. That particular Conservative tactic deserves a few special moments. The content in this omnibus bill ranges from changes that gut health and safety protection for workers, to reductions at the Veterans Review and Appeals Board, to gutting the National Research Council, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of this country's top scientists and researchers have been laid off or muzzled, Mr. Speaker. They cannot speak their minds. They're not free to outline their research or their findings. Why, Mr. Speaker? For fear of retribution. That's the answer, Mr. Speaker. They cannot speak for fear of losing their jobs, for fear of being blackballed, for fear of being blacklisted. Now with C-4, the Conservatives are cutting nearly half of the positions at the National Research Council and giving more power to their hand-picked chairman. Mr. Speaker, question. Have I lost you yet? Have I lost you? Because the content goes on, Mr. Speaker. The content goes on. It goes on. It goes on. This omnibus bill also includes two entirely new acts, Mr. Speaker. The Mackenzie Gas Project Impacts Fund Act and the Public Service Labour Relations and Employment Board Act. This omnibus bill repeals the Canada Employment Insurance Financing Board. Mr. Speaker, have I lost you yet? This bill pushes ahead with their tax hike on Labour-sponsored venture capital funds. This omnibus bill even gives new immigration powers to the minister, Mr. Speaker. Bill C-4 allows the Minister of Immigration to create a requirement that foreign nationals wanting to enter or remain in Canada as permanent residents must be issued an invitation from the minister or must express their interest to the minister through an expression of interest. Have I lost you now, Mr. Speaker? Do I sound like I'm all over the place, Mr. Speaker? I should sound like I'm all over the place, Mr. Speaker, because I am all over the place, Mr. Speaker. More specifically, this Conservative omnibus bill is all over the place with everything in it but the kitchen sink. The tabling of such a wide-ranging bill in such a short time frame, Mr. Speaker, undermines Parliament. Why, Mr. Speaker? Why does it undermine Parliament? Why does this omnibus bill undermine Parliament? Because it denies MPs the ability to thoroughly study the bill and its implications. The short answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to move on now from content to process. Earlier today, this Conservative government introduced time allocation on this bill, Bill C-4. With this motion, the Conservatives have shut down debate 58 times since the election in the spring of 2011. 58 times. 4 times alone, Mr. Speaker, since the opening of the new session. The Conservatives are setting records, Mr. Speaker. They're setting records, all right, the worst kind of records. They rushed this bill through the House at second reading. They rushed this bill through the House at second reading in order for the Finance Committee, Mr. Speaker, to start studying it. But, Mr. Speaker, the Finance Committee was busy with pre-budget consultations so that it took almost 3 weeks, Mr. Speaker, before they could start studying the bill. That's the Conservative process for you, Mr. Speaker. And what happens when they rush a bill through the House, Mr. Speaker? Well, they make mistakes. This government is using their omnibus budget bills to fix mistakes that they made in previous omnibus budget bills. So, Mr. Speaker, what does this omnibus budget bill do for the Canadian economy? Let's see. Despite what the Conservatives claim, it eliminates thousands of jobs. It cuts direct program spending. It weakens GDP growth. The Conservatives told Canadians to wait an extra month for Parliament to resume this fall so they could reset their policy agenda. Press the reset button, Mr. Speaker. Only, Mr. Speaker, they missed the reset button or ignored it entirely, and they hit the carry on as if they were normal button. Only the Conservatives aren't normal, Mr. Speaker. They're so far right, they've lost sight of the Canadian way. The Canadian way in terms of balance between development and the environment, the Canadian way in terms of balance between industry and regulation, the Canadian way in terms of balance between health, safety, and profit, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives claim the economy is their flagship. That's what they boast most about, Mr. Speaker, the economy. To that sentiment, I quote Michael Harris. He's well known in my province of Newfoundland and Labrador for his writing, Mr. Speaker, and for his journalism. But just as well, he's known just as well, Mr. Speaker, here on the mainland. Let me quote from Michael Harris. Quote, "The PM and his government are not good managers. The nauseating repetition of the claim that the Tories know what they're doing with the country's finances will not make it so. They pissed away more money than Madonna on a shopping spree, $1 billion on the G820 meetings that put a dent in the world's Perrier supply and little else. They just plain lost, Mr. Speaker, $3.2 billion, and the guy in charge over at Treasury Board is still there. They're such good fiscal managers that we now have the highest deficit in our history." End quote, Mr. Speaker. Over the last couple of decades or more, the median wage rate has hardly changed. Hardly changed, Mr. Speaker. Let me make another point on omnibus bills, Mr. Speaker. This omnibus bill, again, as I said earlier, amends 70 laws or regulations, 70. As Conservative commentator Andrew Coyne has pointed out, there is no way to know whether a particular MP supported or opposed a particular bill in the bunch. There's no common thread between them, no overarching principle. They represent not a single act of policy, but a sort of compulsory buffet. Mr. Speaker, it won't be long now before a Conservative MP stands up in this House, across the way in this House, and rips into an opposition MP for not supporting a particular piece of legislation. When the legislation they're ripping us for was likely contained in an omnibus bill, and it was that omnibus bill that the opposition MP voted down. It's an insane Conservative circle, Mr. Speaker. This government stuffs as much non-related legislation into an omnibus bill as possible to get as much passed, to get as much by Canadians as possible, Mr. Speaker. Conservative MPs stand in this House day after day after day, and they sidestep or they outright ignore pointed questions on scandal, on abuse, on government itself. But Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are paying attention, Mr. Speaker. Canadians, Mr. Speaker, are paying attention. The deception is sinking in. We'll work tirelessly on this side of the House to ensure that they don't forget. We'll work tirelessly on this side of the House to ensure they don't forget these massive omnibus bills or the non-answers. We'll work tirelessly to ensure they don't forget this government's undemocratic ways, this government's un-Canadian ways, Mr. Speaker. Jack Layton once said that the moment you're absolutely sick and tired of repeating a message, so tired that you can't possibly repeat it another time, it's only then, Mr. Speaker, that the message is sinking in, that the message is getting across. I'll never tire of spreading the truth about Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, and their agenda. Thank you very much.
Questions?